Hi, everybody. It's Miss Amber here with the English 12A live lesson for today. Today's lesson is actually 2.1, so the second lesson in the second unit, and that would be the introduction to the English Renaissance. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Okay. So we're getting started on slide number 5 as usual. So basically, they start off with just giving you an overview of the Renaissance. They tell you when it happened, beginning in the 1400s in the city-states of Italy. So they tell you when and where. During this time period, Europe experienced many cultural changes and saw a return to classical thought, which meant the rebirth of ideas and thoughts of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So whenever something is referring to classical, that is usually what they're talking about. Neoclassical is when you bring back classical thought. The Renaissance is the original, or I guess the first time, I should say, that culture shifted back to this. In the 1700s, neoclassicism was also a thing, but it was called neo because neo means new and classical means, the classics. So it was the classics in the new age. It's important to remember that the Renaissance and the era of neoclassicism are very similar, but different just because one happened before the other. The Renaissance happened first. So they give you the definition of the word Renaissance. It means rebirth. During this time, there were many advances in the fields of literature, the arts, science, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, cartography, which is the official word for map making, and medicine. So pretty much, this was more of a thinking sort of age, which is probably the influence of the classical thought. And they're going to go into a little more detail about how that played out in the next slides. So here, they give you a photo of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This was built during the Renaissance. So this gives you an idea of what the architecture was like that people were into at the time. A resurgence of columns, lots of different reliefs. Reliefs are pictures and depicted images of like basically telling a story. You can sort of see those sort of pictures on the motifs here. Usually if there's people doing things or showing, if someone is being shown as telling a story, showing the journey of someone over time, usually you can see that on a relief. Now on this slide, they give you a lot of information about how the thought process of the classics were incorporated into things. So this is just actually a lot of information, and there's no real way to get past it other than to like actually just write down what's important. So here, they start off with the emphasis on the philosophical thought of ancient Greece that emerged during this time period was particularly important to the development of humanism. So I want to write down this whole sentence in my notes just as an example of what to put down. I would definitely say so that the emphasis on philosophy, that's where we get the philosophical thought, was important to the development of humanism. That's what I would start off by saying. And that's just a shorter way of saying what's in this sentence. And then they give you the definition for humanism. So it says humanism right here can be described as an intellectual movement. So intellectual means having to do with intelligence that focused on those areas that were considered classic. So classic, again, means things that the Grecians and Romans emphasized during their periods. So they give you a list of all the stuff that includes. So I would include that list. It includes rhetoric. Rhetoric is how people speak and how people make their points and argue with each other. Grammar, poetry, history, Latin, and Greek. And these subjects became known as the humanities. Now, if you've been to a school ever, you may have heard someone refer to topics as the humanities. And this is the original source of that word. So, to give you a little more information about humanism, humanism teaches the values of reason, scientific inquiry, and human fulfillment in the natural world. Now, another important point separate from the information about humanism is that these ideas went against the teachings of the Catholic Church. So the interesting thing about this time is that even though these teachings went against the Catholic Church, first of all, we're going to focus on the reason why, actually. The reason why these went against the teachings of the Catholic Church is because all of these things are considered, like these pursuits, these different types of learning and things like that. It's not just these things. Like there was obviously poetry. There are religious people who have written books, written poetry. They knew Latin. Some religious people did know Greek. Grammar and all of the stuff that's on this list here, the rhetoric and everything. These things individually by themselves were not against the teachings of the church. It was how they were taught that was against the teachings. Now, when you are dealing with the Catholic Church and most Christian religions in general, not all of them, but most of them, the idea of dealing with yourself and focusing on yourself and not God or the community that is praising God is what is actually against the Catholic teachings. So trying to learn all these things for the betterment of yourself as an individual person instead of to serve the institution or the church is the actual problem. But the interesting thing here is that humanists applied the individual achievement that they got from learning about all of these things to religion. And they started encouraging people to seek their own relationships with God. So if you are practicing, for example, if you are a practicing Baptist, for example, an Episcopalian, if you are a practicing Universalist, the idea of having your own one-on-one relationship with God came with this period of time. Excuse me. That is how that idea developed. Humanism pushed being better for yourself. And so people who were religious and who believed in the humanities believed in making sure that your relationship with God was right based on what you knew about the teachings. And the reason why that's important is for two reasons. The two reasons are that one, the Catholic Church didn't teach individuality as being important. It was all about the community. It was all about being subject to what other people in the community think or feel about what you're doing. So that was an issue. And then secondly, part of the issue with that is that if everyone has their own individual relationship with God, that makes it harder for the church to argue that you should access the religious procedures and rituals that you need to facilitate your relationship through them. So basically, the church acted as the go-between for the common person and God. Your average person didn't know Greek or Latin. So they had to go through people at the church to learn. They had to go through people at the church to figure out what the teachings were saying, how to apply them, how to get advice, how to go about getting forgiveness. But if you are learning all of these things on your own so that you can do it yourself, then what do you need the church for? And that's part of the issue. The Catholic Church had a lot of influence, and they were afraid that if individual people could just interact with their religion and rituals themselves without having to go through someone that had, like proper training, that would be a problem. They feared for it on a moral level, with it potentially leading people astray. Because if you have other people teaching who are not with the church, they could say anything. And then on a political and social scale, there was also the issue of, if we have all these people who can do what we're doing, then we won't have as much influence or power over the areas where our religion has a hold. So with the rise of humanism and people being really into individualism, the Catholic Church was still influential, but not as much. People weren't questioning whether or not Christianity was important, even though all of the issues with corruption in the church and things like that. So people weren't saying, "Oh man, is Christianity like the way to go?" There was no question there. People believed very strongly in Christianity at this time, but there were questioning what's the best way to practice Christianity. And it was this question that helped spark the Protestant Reformation. It says here, this basic question sparked the Protestant Reformation and caused turmoil throughout Europe. Because once people realized, oh man, there are ways to practice Christianity that don't involve the church, which was considered to be pretty corrupt at this time. Once they realized they didn't have to go through the church or deal with them or feel like they were being taken advantage of by them, different groups broke off from the Catholic Church to do their own thing. So here we get information about the Reformation. That's where we start. So they start talking about basically the earlier sections of people doubting the church. So they talk about this man named John Wycliffe in the 1830s. He was pretty well known for disagreeing with the church's teachings. He wanted to limit the power of the church because they were so corrupt. And he felt like the authorities of the church were sinful. Like, you preach all these things, you're telling us about this, that, and the third, but the people that you put in charge aren't practicing it. So if we believe in Christianity and we believe in the idea of salvation through what you've told us, then there are people that you're protecting who are breaking these rules too. And you should do something about that. Now, if you remember from some of our earlier lessons, the whole Thomas à Becket thing with the Canterbury Tales and stuff like that, there was definitely an issue. There was 100% an issue with the authority at the time, not just the church, but also the church fighting with the crown and trying to figure out who was going to outmaneuver each other. Certain people just didn't trust the church because they were extorting people for money. People felt like they couldn't be, trusted. There's just a lot of upheaval at this time. So people started breaking away from that. Wycliffe denounced church officials, and he basically said that the rituals, so like pardoning, being forgiven, coming to the church, all the stuff that the church told you to do, was unnecessary if you had your own personal relationship with God. If you could find someone local who understood Latin and Greek, who could break down the Bible for you and give you the information that you need, that you don't have to go through these people who are clearly corrupt and not looking out for your best interests, is pretty much what he was telling people. It got to, like, things between Wycliffe and the church pretty much went back and forth for a while, with him denouncing them and them trying to discredit him. But what changed the game was that he helped produce John Wycliffe, he helped produce the first handwritten English language Bible. And part of what made this a big deal was that the Bible was only available in Latin up until this point. Now, if you remember from previous lessons, people could only learn Latin from servicing the church or just being rich and well-traveled or well-educated due to money. Common men and women did not speak Latin. They also didn't speak French, which was popular at the time. So they couldn't read the Bible themselves. So if they had a question, or if they were looking for information, they could not actually find it without going through the church. But with John Wycliffe putting out this version of the book, they could read it for themselves to see, oh, are these people lying to me? Are they misdirecting me? Are they using this the wrong way? And this is when the Catholic Church really started getting afraid that people were moving away from them. Oh man, they got their own version of the Bible. They don't have to come to us for translations and things. What's going to motivate them to come to church if we can't read and translate for them, But Wycliffe had a lot of supporters. And his Bible was in distribution long after his death. So it was obvious from the number of copies that exist that it was very popular. So basically, that pretty much kicked off some of the unrest that was going on in this country, or rather in England, in England at this time. So pretty much, after John Wycliffe's spat back and forth with the church, a lot of religious thinkers, activists, and people who were just sort of philosophizing on their own at the time started trying to change the church and form their own groups. So they talk about here, one of these groups was based on a published set of questions. So it says here, on October 31st, 1517, a German priest named Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, a set of questions challenging the practices of the Catholic Church officials. Luther also raised questions about the rightful extent to the Pope's religious authority. It is believed that Luther nailed his theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, Germany. And his questions brought him into conflict with the church and the Pope, who threatened to excommunicate him. But he had a lot of supporters. So basically, he was able to organize his own church. And let's see. The availability of the printing press, which had been invented recently, helped him make lots of copies of his book. So his book didn't have to be handwritten like John Wycliffe's did, since this is the 1500s, 200 years later. The printing press was a thing, so he was able to just do his, he was able to basically print his book over and over, and it was distributed and translated all over Europe. Now, this screen basically is a video, slide 12, of what life was like during this time, during the Renaissance, and emphasis on different things that you should have a little more detail about. It's about 10 minutes long, so you're going to have to actually spend a little time watching this. Let's see. Okay, so then we have the Elizabethan period. So Britons who lived during the long reign of Elizabeth I are called Elizabethans. The thinkers, philosophers, and religious leaders of the time had a distinct way of looking at the world. So they were part of this time period, the Renaissance, and they definitely look back to classic models for inspiration. They were influenced by Aristotle specifically in his view of natural order. So that's like a really big thing, and they're going to give you details about it in this slide and the next one. So his view of natural order was called a scale of nature. So the scale wasn't really a scale the way that we think of one with like the two sides weighing things. Instead, his was a ladder that stretched up. So at the top of the ladder was God, or the creator. And then everything underneath, all the different types of plants, animals, people, places, things, had their own rung, which is, like each step level of the ladder. The idea was that everything was made perfectly, everything belonged where it is, and things shouldn't try to move up or down from where they have been placed in a hierarchy. Now, how did they decide this hierarchy? Basically, just themselves. They decided themselves. So the Elizabethan thinkers changed the great scale to something that was known as the Great Chain of Being. So they made a hierarchy of their own. God was at the top because he made everything. Obviously, he's the most perfect type of being. And then next is the heavenly host, which is like the angels, and then humans who were created by God in his image. So we're moving from closest to God down lower. So below humans are other things like animals, plants, rocks, and minerals in that exact order. So Within those rungs, so within those levels, so like within animals, there were other divisions, and they give you examples of that here. So for example, within the human tier, they put the king at the top. So you have to remember that kings are supposedly, appointed by God. They have like royalty in their veins and that kind of thing. So that's why they're at the top. It says here, within the animal kingdom, the lion was considered the most kingly animal. And since it was most king-like, they put it at the top of the animal chain. It doesn't matter that there were other animals that could take down a lion. It doesn't matter that there's animals that could escape lions on a regular basis. What they cared about was the scale according to what they thought was important. They put a flea on the lowliest, but you also have to remember there wasn't science in the way that we think of it at this time. So microscopic animals, viruses, and stuff like that are not things that people knew existed at this time. So they weren't thinking of like amoebas or white blood cells or anything like that. So the idea of the Great Chain was that you are supposed to stay where you are, and that to change from where you belong is to betray God's plan, which is a bad thing. At this time, Elizabethans were also interested in the natural world. So that's there was a lot of emphasis on the 4 elements. We know them very well: earth, air, fire, and water. So alchemy was based on the idea of these elements and some others being able to be combined in every possible way. So some combination of the 4 elements existed in everything in the world, especially in the formation of human nature. The elements influenced appearance, health, personality, and behavior. So they would associate certain things like beauty or grace or aggression and anger with these different elements. And they would talk about, similarly to how we do zodiac things now based on this same system, they used to associate certain traits that people could have personality wise with these elements. So they were very worried about basically human nature, God's plan, and how people should be and how people should act. So people believed in the existence of free will, but within what God wanted them to do. So they believed that negative traits like pride, greed, envy, and things like that would lead humans to sin. But if they used their free will, they could overcome it and make their way to heaven at the end of their life. And another thing to note here that's actually important: Elizabethan religious leaders at the time took the Bible literally. So if God was everywhere, they reasoned, the devil also had to be everywhere. And that's the reason why they feared magic and supernatural things as tools of evil. They thought that the devil was everywhere and in everything, the same way that God was, since the devil opposes God. So the excerpt that we have for this lesson is The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, which is a story that's basically written to show how people think, or how people thought at this time, that following the devil and being selfish and going beyond what humans are supposed to do would lead to your downfall. So here on this slide, they talk about Christopher Marlowe and Faustus. So the most important thing to take away from this slide is that Christopher Marlowe was very mysterious. We know he was born in 1564 and that he was well educated. He was the rival to William Shakespeare. So William Shakespeare was like a big writer at the time, and Christopher Marlowe was his main competitor. So he wrote plays and things too, but they just weren't quite as popular as Shakespeare. There's a lot of mystery around his life. People think he might have been a spy for Queen Elizabeth I or the English Catholics. He was kind of well known for writing on the edge stuff, which is why he wasn't as popular as Shakespeare. But he was pretty famous for it. No one really knows how he died. He died at 29, which was young even for that time. And the official story is that he was stabbed to death. during a fight over dinner, but no one really knows. So pretty much he's pretty mysterious, but his works are famous. Okay, so now we get into the actual writing for the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. So there's some information to know, which is going to be covered in these last couple slides. So it was very controversial when it was first performed because it actually shows Dr. Faustus in the play bargaining with the devil. That's what the entire play is about. He wants more power so he can do more things for himself, and he decides he's willing to sell his soul for it. And since Elizabethan philosophers were very sensitive about these issues, it was considered controversial to show someone making a deal with the devil, even if the point of the play was to show, oh, well, this is bad. So it was considered to be pretty edgy. People thought it was actually possible to make deals with the devil. So there was also the question of like, how did Marlowe get the information to write this? They didn't consider it a piece of fiction. They thought that maybe he spoke to someone who actually made this deal and that someone like this existed in real life. So they were pretty kind of like afraid of it. Now this slide just goes over the way that he wrote this story. It was written in blank verse. So the lines are unrhymed in the same meter. So he uses iambic pentameter, which is basically 5 patterns in each line of unstressed and then stressed. So even though blank verse had been used before then by other people, it became a standard during the Renaissance. So it's important to make that a note. This is the verse that most things were written in at this time. Marlowe and Shakespeare both used blank verse very skillfully. And according to people who were alive at that time, they were able to make their dialogues sound how they thought people spoke normally at the time. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're reading the excerpt that they link down here. Then they give you the plot. So this plot isn't very complicated. Pretty much, it's set in the 1580s in Germany, in Italy. It's not quite the same as a morality play. Because they question and challenge Christian values and morals in here. They actually kind of give you like a what if back and forth. Is this right? Is this right? How do we get here? How do we stop ourselves from getting here? Is it the nature of the church that pushes people to do these kind of things? So that's what made it a little different than a morality play, but it still deals with good and evil the way that morality plays do. So the long story short of the plot is that Faustus wants power, and he wants it so badly that he's willing to make a deal with the devil. There's like a prologue that tells everyone about Faustus's background. He was born in a humble family, but he's basically a genius prodigy. But he wants more knowledge. He wants to know more. He wants to know the most out of everyone and have more power than anyone. So he decides to do research on black magic, which is a practice that in the Bible is said to be wrong. He ends up renouncing God so that he can get more information. He's basically like, well, if the devil has all the information I need, then why am I worshiping God? What I should actually be doing is worshiping whoever will give me the information and power to do what I want. So he ends up making a deal with Lucifer, also known as Satan, in exchange for basically, so he trades his soul for 24 years of service from a demon named Mephistopheles. You may have heard of him before, who is a servant of Lucifer. So basically, he goes around the world. He travels for a long time. He's able to use his powers to get things and to do things. And he gets a lot of warnings from divine creatures at this time. And the divine creatures are kind of like, oh, man, you know, like, this isn't the way to go. We're trying to tell you right now, please, like, do something different. And he kind of ignores them because he wants the power. But once he gets to the end, he realizes he actually has to trade his soul. Like, nothing's going to save him. He tries to repent and he feels bad about what he's done, but it's definitely too late and his soul is carried off to hell. That's pretty much the whole story. It's an older text, so it might be a little more difficult to read. So it helps to know the plot in the beginning so you can try to follow along when you actually get into the story. Now, we also talk about themes, motifs, and symbols. So basically, it's about good and evil. It's about good and evil trying to battle to win over this one person, Faustus. And they talk about some other themes in here. They talk about free will being dangerous. This is listed right here. Free will can be dangerous because you can choose to do bad things. Human nature is torn between good and evil. Humans have to choose between redemption and damnation, and absolute power causes corruption. Because remember, he trades his soul for power and knowledge. Marlowe, the author, uses all of these motifs pretty much to make people think like, yeah, you're supposed to use your free will to overcome sin. But what if you don't? What happens if you don't? And that was a very scary idea for people back then. He uses symbols in his writing. For example, there's a scene where Faustus goes to sign his contract with Lucifer in blood, and something weird happens without giving it away in the story. It's pretty much divine intervention from a holy being to try to stop him from actually signing. So they try to prove that goodness pervades in the world. Goodness actually does step up to the plate and try to prevent people from being awful. So you truly have to choose doing the wrong things to actually be awful. And they try to emphasize that so that people know, don't choose to do the wrong things. If you're doing something scummy and it doesn't work out, maybe you weren't supposed to do it. So those kind of ideas date back all the way to these kind of morality plays. And I think that's actually it for this lesson. So just keep all of that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Just try to keep all of that in mind while you're going through the story. And if you're having any trouble with reading it, please schedule tutoring with a tutor. It'll be either me, Ms. Vahovic, and in some cases, your mentor or advocate may be able to help. If you need to access any of the English concept summaries, if you're a Step Up student, please email the English email at english@atsedu.net. And you can also ask your advocate for the link to the English concepts worksheet. I think that that's just about it. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.